My name is Dr. Jonathan Reeves, and on April 14th, 2016, my life changed forever. For years, I was convinced that faith was nothing more than wishful thinking, a crutch for those who couldn't accept the cold, hard reality of science. As a professor of neuroscience at Columbia University, I spent my career studying the brain, convinced that every religious experience could be explained through neural activity, chemical imbalances, or psychological conditioning. I built a reputation dismantling spiritual claims, debating pastors and theologians, and writing best-selling books that promoted atheism. My mother, Margaret, a devout Christian, never stopped praying for me, but I saw her faith as nothing more than sentimental superstition. On the morning of my accident, I was preparing to speak at an atheist symposium in Chicago, where I was scheduled to share the stage with Sam Harris and other well-known skeptics. My lecture was meant to expose the so-called myth of near-death experiences, arguing that they were nothing more than hallucinations produced by a dying brain. As I drove to the university in my Tesla Model S, I found myself behind a large truck carrying steel pipes. As the truck turned a sharp bend, one of the straps snapped, and before I could react, a pipe crashed through my windshield. The force crushed my chest, puncturing my lung, and I felt my body shutting down. Blood filled my throat, sirens blared in the distance, and as my vision darkened, an overwhelming fear took hold, not just of dying, but of something far worse. For 9 minutes, I was clinically dead. I had always believed that death was simply the end, like turning off a computer, a quiet, empty nothingness. But I was wrong. I felt myself floating above my car, watching as paramedics fought to bring me back, but before I could even process what was happening, I was violently ripped away. There was no tunnel of light, no sense of peace, only terror. The world around me darkened as I was dragged downward, faster than anything I had ever experienced. The air turned thick, suffocating, and the stench of sulfur filled my lungs. The screams of countless souls echoed in the distance, growing louder as I descended. Then suddenly I was there, in a vast, nightmarish cavern bathed in a dim, reddish glow. The heat was unbearable, not like the kind you feel on a summer day, but something deeper, something that burned from the inside out. The ground beneath me wasn't solid, it seemed alive, pulsing with an energy that I could only describe as torment itself. Shadows moved all around me, shifting, writhing, suffering. And then I heard the voices, wailing, screaming, begging for mercy that would never come. I tried to convince myself that this was just a dream, some last hallucination of a dying brain, but everything felt too real, more real than anything I had ever known. My mind, which had always relied on science to explain reality, could not comprehend what I was experiencing. I turned and saw figures in the distance, people wandering aimlessly in the darkness, their faces twisted in agony. Then I recognized them. These were men I had once admired, scientists, philosophers, skeptics, men who had dedicated their lives to disproving God. I saw Stephen Hawking, his body no longer confined to a wheelchair, but his mind trapped in endless torment. Christopher Hitchens, a man whose sharp wit I had once envied, now silent, his screams lost in the abyss. Richard Dawkins, his eyes filled with horror as he watched his own words play before him, the arguments he had once spoken now condemning him. Every single one of them had been so certain, just like I had been. Then I saw something even worse. There, scattered throughout the cavern, were faces I recognized from my lectures, my books, my debates. Former students, colleagues, readers who had trusted me, who had looked up to me as an authority. Their eyes locked onto mine, filled with hatred, pain, betrayal. You told us there was nothing after death, they cried. You said belief in God was foolish. You led us here. The weight of their accusations crushed me. I had spent my entire life convinced that I was guiding people toward truth, but now, standing in the depths of this place, I realized I had been leading them straight into destruction. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, almost as if it were alive, feeding off my despair. The heat intensified, and the stench of burning flesh filled the air, making it impossible to breathe. I looked around, searching for a way out, but the cavern stretched endlessly in every direction. Then, without warning, a deafening voice echoed through the darkness, not a voice spoken aloud, but one that shook the very core of my soul. You were given knowledge, yet you denied truth. You were shown creation, yet you mocked the Creator. You were given time, yet you led others astray. The voice was neither angry nor emotional. It was absolute, unshakable, as if it carried the weight of eternity itself. In that moment, my entire life flashed before me. I saw every debate, every mocking laugh, every book I had written arguing against God. I saw my mother praying for me, tears streaming down her face as she begged God to reach me before it was too late. I had dismissed her faith as weakness, but now I saw the truth. Her prayers had been the only thing standing between me and complete separation from God. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of my own arrogance. I had spent my life believing that science held all the answers, that reason and logic were the highest truths. But now, in this place, none of that mattered. My arguments, my research, my theories, they meant nothing here. The only thing that mattered was the truth I had refused to see. And then, just as the darkness threatened to consume me completely, a light appeared. It was distant at first, barely visible through the shadows, but it grew brighter, cutting through the darkness like a sword. I felt something pulling me toward it, lifting me out of the abyss. The light grew stronger, and for the first time since my descent, the unbearable heat began to fade. The cries of the damned grew distant, muffled, as if some invisible force was pulling me away from their torment. I felt myself rising, though I had no control over it, as if something far greater than me had decided to intervene. The weight of my sins, my arrogance, my rejection of God, none of it disappeared, but something else filled me. A presence, overwhelming yet familiar, surrounded me. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't just light, it was love, a love so pure that it made every achievement, every accolade, every piece of knowledge I had ever gained seem insignificant. And then the voice had spoke again, but this time it wasn't condemning. It was offering something I never thought I deserved. You have been shown the truth, but will you accept it? I wanted to scream yes, but I felt unworthy. How could I, a man who had spent his entire life rejecting God, ever be forgiven? I had mocked believers, insulted faith, led others away from salvation. I had spent years preaching a false gospel of science as the ultimate truth, dismissing those who spoke of God as ignorant and weak-minded. And yet, here I was, standing in the presence of undeniable truth, being given a choice that I did not deserve. I didn't need proof anymore. I didn't need evidence, experiments, or logical equations to explain what I was experiencing. I knew, deep in my soul, I knew. God was real. Heaven and hell were real. Everything I had denied, everything I had fought against was true. And despite everything I had done, despite the countless people I had led astray, I was being given a second chance. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "Forgive me." The moment those words left my lips, the light engulfed me completely, and I felt something I had never felt before: peace. The next thing I remember was the sound of beeping, a rhythmic, steady beeping, pulling me back to consciousness. My eyelids felt heavy, my body ached beyond anything I had ever known, but I was alive. As my vision cleared, I saw the pale white ceiling of a hospital room, fluorescent lights humming above me. The pain in my chest was unbearable, and every breath felt like fire, but none of that mattered. I was back. I had been given another chance. A nurse rushed to my bedside, calling out to the doctors that I was awake. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw, my voice barely a whisper. As I struggled to form words, memories of what I had seen flooded my mind. The cavern, the torment, the faces of those I had led astray, it all felt as real as the hospital room around me. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious, but I knew that what I had experienced wasn't just a dream or a hallucination. It was truth. And now, I had to face the consequences of that truth. The first person to visit me was my father. His eyes were filled with relief, but I could also see something else, hesitation, as if he wasn't sure if I was really the same person. And he was right to hesitate. I wasn't the same. He sat beside me, gripping my hand, and before he could even speak, I whispered, "Dad, I was wrong." His eyes widened and tears filled them. He knew exactly what I meant. For years, I had dismissed his faith, argued with him, mocked him for believing in what I had called a fairy tale. But now, the very thing I had ridiculed was the only thing that mattered. Tears streamed down my father's face, but he didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't need to. He simply squeezed my hand and nodded, his voice shaking as he whispered, "I've been praying for this moment my whole life." At that moment, the weight of everything I had done came crashing down on me. The arrogance, the debates, the books I had written, all of it had been built on a lie. And worst of all, I had convinced others to believe that lie too. How many people had I led away from God? How many souls had trusted me, only to be pulled further into disbelief because of my words? The thought was unbearable. The days that followed were filled with both physical and emotional pain. My doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that the steel pipe had missed my heart by mere inches. But I knew better. This wasn't luck. This was mercy. I had been given a second chance, but what would I do with it? The thought haunted me as I lay in that hospital bed, unable to shake the memories of the people I had seen in the darkness. The ones who had trusted me, the ones who had followed me, the ones who had begged me with their eyes, "Why did you lie to us?" I knew what I had to do. As soon as I was strong enough, I made the hardest decision of my life. I had to renounce everything, my books, my lectures, my debates. I had to go public, to tell the world what I had seen, no matter the cost. I had spent years building a reputation as a respected scientist, an authority on consciousness and the mind. But now I had to throw it all away. I had to tell the world that I had been wrong. And that's exactly what I did. The first thing I did was delete my YouTube channel. Reality Check with Dr. Reeves had over 300,000 subscribers, followers who had trusted me to provide rational explanations for everything, including why belief in God was supposedly a delusion. But I couldn't let those videos stay up. I couldn't let my words continue leading people away from the truth. With shaking hands, I wiped my entire catalog, years of content gone in minutes. And then I did something even harder. I recorded a new video. Sitting in my dimly lit hospital room, I stared into the camera, feeling my heart pound in my chest. I was wrong, I said. Everything I believed, everything I taught was a lie. I spoke about my accident, my death, and the horrifying truth I had witnessed on the other side. I described the cavern, the suffering, the undeniable reality of hell. I told my audience how I had seen famous scientists, intellectuals, even my own followers trapped in torment, their souls consumed by the very lies I had once preached. My voice broke as I admitted that I had been responsible for leading people to destruction. I spent my life trying to prove that God wasn't real. But now I know the truth. He is real, and He gave me another chance. The backlash was immediate. Atheist forums and social media exploded with people calling me delusional, brain-damaged, or a fraud. Former colleagues at Columbia University distanced themselves, some even calling for my resignation. Skeptic magazine ran an article analyzing my case as a trauma-induced religious psychosis. My inbox filled with messages from professors I once considered friends, begging me to reconsider, telling me I was ruining my career. But didn't matter. I had seen what awaited those who rejected God, and nothing could make me stay silent. I knew my career was over the moment I hit upload. The respect I had built over decades vanished overnight. Invitations to speak at conferences were revoked. Research grants that once flowed so easily were suddenly under review. Even my own students, those who had admired my work, now saw me as a cautionary tale, a once brilliant scientist who had supposedly lost his mind. But I didn't care. The truth was more important than my reputation, more important than my career, more important than anything I had built for myself in this world. One of the hardest moments came when I received an email from Dr. Alan Whitmore, a close friend and fellow neuroscientist. He didn't bother with small talk. His message was short and to the point. "John, I don't know what happened to you, but you're throwing away everything you've worked for. People are laughing at you. Do you really want to be remembered as the professor who had a mental breakdown and turned into a preacher?" I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling. A few months ago, I would have laughed along with him. But now I knew that this world, this short, fleeting life, meant nothing compared to eternity. The worst part wasn't the academic backlash. It was knowing that my past words were still out there, still poisoning minds, still turning people away from God. It didn't matter how many times I told the truth now. The damage had already been done. How many people had made the choice to reject God because of something I had said? That thought haunted me more than any insult, any lost opportunity, any ruined friendship. I had spent my life tearing down faith, and now I had to spend the rest of my days trying to undo the damage. I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had been given a second chance for a reason, and I had to use it to warn others before it was too late. So I kept speaking out. I started a new YouTube channel, Science and Spirit with Dr. Reeves, not to argue, not to debate, but to tell people the truth I had seen with my own eyes. At first, the response was brutal. My subscriber count was a fraction of what it once was, and the comment sections were flooded with mockery. People called me a liar, a lunatic, a man who had let trauma rewrite his brain. Some of my old atheist followers made reaction videos, dissecting my testimony, laughing at my words. But for every insult, for every person who dismissed me, there were others who listened, others who reached out. I started getting emails, not from skeptics looking to debate me, but from people who had experienced something similar. Scientists, doctors, soldiers, people who had brushed up against death and seen what lay beyond, but had been too afraid to speak about it. A young woman named Rachel wrote to me, saying she had been an atheist for years, but had secretly struggled with doubts. "Your story was the first time I heard someone talk about science and faith without sounding crazy," she wrote. "I don't know what to do with this information, but I can't ignore it anymore." Another message came from a former student, someone who had taken my class years ago and had once admired my logic. "Dr. Reeves, I mocked faith because of you. Now I don't know what to believe." These messages reminded me why I couldn't give up. I had led so many people away from God, and I knew I couldn't reach all of them, but if I could save even one, if even one soul turned back toward the truth because of my testimony, it would be worth it. I started speaking at churches, at community centers, at any place that would have me. The rooms were smaller than the packed auditoriums I was used to, but the impact was greater. People weren't just listening, they were changing. Some cried as I described the reality of hell, realizing for the first time what rejecting God really meant. Others told me they had spent years struggling with doubt, unsure if they could reconcile faith with science. I told them the truth, they could. Science had never disproven God. It had always pointed to him. As I spoke to more people, I realized that my mission wasn't just about telling my story. It was about undoing the damage I had caused. The weight of my past still sat heavy on my shoulders. How many people had died still believing the lies I once preached? How many souls had passed into eternity with no chance to hear the truth? I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could do everything in my power to change the future. I made it my goal to expose the deception I had once believed. I revisited my old research, my past lectures, my books that had argued against God, and I saw the flaws I had been blind to before. The fine-tuning of the universe, the complexity of DNA, the mystery of human consciousness, none of it pointed to a godless existence. It was all evidence of divine design. How had I missed it for so long? The truth was, I had never really been searching for truth. I had been searching for ways to justify my unbelief, to prove to myself that I was in control, that I didn't need God. But now I could see it clearly. The hardest part was facing my former colleagues. Many of them had stopped speaking to me altogether, but some still reached out, not to support me, but to convince me to stop. One professor I had worked with for years sat across from me in a coffee shop and sighed before saying, "John, even if you believe all this, why are you throwing your life away? You could keep your faith private. You don't have to ruin your career over this." I looked him in the eyes and said, "I stood in hell, Alan. I saw where this road leads. If I stay silent, I might as well be pushing people toward it." He shook his head, called me a fool, and walked away. But I wasn't a fool. For the first time in my life, I knew what was real. And no matter how many people laughed, no matter how much I lost, I would never deny it again. The more I spoke out, the more I realized just how deep the deception ran. There were so many people, intelligent, logical, well-educated people, who had fallen into the same trap I had. They weren't rejecting God because of evidence. They were rejecting him because they didn't want him to be real. I knew because I had done the same thing. Accepting God meant accepting that I wasn't in control. It meant admitting that I had been wrong, that I had lived my life in rebellion against the very Creator who had given me the ability to think and reason in the first place. It was pride. That was the real issue. It always had been. And yet, even as I lost colleagues and former friends, something incredible started happening. People were waking up. At first, it was just a few emails, private messages, quiet confessions after I spoke at a church. But then, it started spreading. I was invited onto podcasts, radio shows, even television interviews, not because people wanted to believe me, but because they couldn't ignore the fact that a scientist who had once been a leading voice for atheism was now saying I was wrong. Some interviews were respectful. Others were brutal. I sat across from well-known skeptics, people I had once worked alongside, as they attacked my credibility, my intelligence, my sanity. Dr. Reeves, one host, asked me on live television how you expect anyone to take you seriously when you're claiming that you saw hell. I took a deep breath, looked directly into the camera, and said, because I was just like you. I didn't believe it either. And that's why I'm here, because I don't want you to end up where I was. There was a long silence before the host awkwardly changed the subject. He didn't have an answer because deep down, I think he knew what I was saying was true. Despite the backlash, my new YouTube channel began to grow. Not as fast as my old one, but this time, the people who followed me weren't just looking for entertainment. They were searching for answers. I received emails from former atheists who had started questioning everything. Others told me that my story had given them the courage to believe again. But the most powerful messages came from those who had been on the edge of losing their faith, people who had been told by professors like me that their beliefs were foolish, that science had disproven God. They had been ready to walk away, just like I had once encouraged others to do. But now, because of my testimony, they saw things differently. One of the most powerful messages I ever received came from a young man named Daniel. He had been studying philosophy at a university where professors, much like I once had, dismissed faith as nothing more than outdated superstition. He told me he had been a Christian his whole life, but after years of being told that belief in God was anti-intellectual, he had started to doubt. He had read my old books, watched my debates, and had nearly convinced himself that atheism was the only logical conclusion. But then he saw my testimony. I was about to abandon my faith completely, he wrote, but your story shook me to my core. If someone like you, someone who had everything to lose, could admit they were wrong, then maybe I was wrong too. His words brought me to tears. I had spent years tearing faith apart, and now, by God's grace, I was helping rebuild it. But for every Daniel, there were 10 more who mocked me, who insisted I was delusional, that I had suffered brain trauma, that I had lost my ability to think critically. I had spent my entire career using science as a weapon against God, and now that same scientific community was using it against me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Former colleagues made reaction videos dissecting my story, calling it nothing more than a hallucination brought on by oxygen deprivation. Professors at Columbia University openly mocked my name, warning students not to fall into the same trap I had. I could have fought back. I could have debated them, thrown research papers and counterarguments in their faces. But I knew that wouldn't work. The problem wasn't the evidence, it was the unwillingness to see the truth. The same unwillingness that had blinded me for decades. And so, instead of arguing, I prayed for them. I prayed that one day, before it was too late, their eyes would be open the way mine had been. As time passed, I began to realize that my story wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my near-death experience or the vision of hell that had shattered my worldview. It was about something much bigger. It was about the countless souls still walking the same path I had once been on, the path of pride, skepticism, and self-deception. I wasn't trying to win debates anymore. I wasn't interested in proving people wrong or showing off my intellect. I only wanted one thing, to make sure that no one else ended up where I had. I started traveling, speaking anywhere I was invited, churches, small colleges, community halls. The crowds were never as large as they had been at my old lectures, but they were different. They weren't there to argue. They weren't there to tear down. They were there to listen, to understand, to seek truth. And every time I told my story, I could see it, the way people's faces changed, the way they leaned in, the way something deep inside them recognized what I was saying as real. But the greatest moment of my journey came when I returned home to visit my mother's grave. She had passed away years before my accident, still praying for me, still hoping that one day I would turn back to God. Standing there, I felt the weight of everything she had carried, the heartbreak of watching her son mock her faith, the pain of knowing I had chosen the world over the truth. But despite all of that, she had never stopped believing that God would reach me. And he had. "Mom, I get it now," I whispered. "And I'm so sorry it took me this long." As I stood there, I realized something. This wasn't just a second chance. This was my purpose. I wasn't meant to live my life chasing academic prestige, building a name for myself, or proving how intelligent I was. I was meant to share this truth, no matter what it cost me. Because the cost of not sharing, it was far greater. If you're watching this right now, I need you to understand something. There is more to this life than what we can see. There is a battle for your soul, whether you realize it or not. I didn't believe it until it was too late, until I saw what happens when we reject God. But you don't have to make the same mistake I did. If you're questioning, if you're doubting, if you're waiting for some kind of sign, this is it. Don't wait until it's too late. Seek the truth now. Turn to God now. Because one day, whether you believe it or not, you will stand before Him. And when that moment comes, the only thing that will matter is the choice you made in this life. If this story moved you, please share it. Someone out there needs to hear this. And if you're struggling, if you have questions, reach out. You're not alone. And most importantly, it's not too late. Thank you for watching, and God bless.